Hello and welcome to Holy Wars, a podcast about religion, coexistence, and the people trying to figure it out. I'm Jeremy McClellan, and my guest today is Matthew Kaemingk, a professor of Christian ethics and author of Christian Hospitality and Muslim Immigration in an Age of Fear. What I like about this book, and the reason I wanted to have Matthew on the podcast, is it's an attempt to provide a robust, non-liberal Christian defense of pluralism. It tries to answer the question, can we welcome people who are truly different without watering down our own religious beliefs and practices? We talk about our shared love of Muslims, Calvinism versus Catholicism, why liberals don't understand religion, and the burning of Notre Dame. I hope you enjoy, and without further ado, welcome to Holy Wars. Matthew, welcome to Holy Wars.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Yeah, thank you for coming. Now, first, just for everyone listening, how in the world do people say your last name?
It's Kaemingk, like a mink coat.
Kaemingk.
Yeah.
Okay, that's good.
You just have like a G in there for fun.
Yeah, I used to date a Dutch girl. She was in the CRC, and everybody she knew was Dutch. And I never got good at saying her name. And I've gotten good at saying other people's names, but I've never made it through Dutch people. So I like how it's just random consonants put in there just to trip people up.
Yeah, we make our names deliberately difficult. It's a way of understanding who's in and who's out.
I really wanted to have you on for a while for a number of reasons. Number one, your Twitter's great, and I like people on Twitter, and that's how I judge people's moral worth. But also, you wrote this book called Christian Hospitality and Muslim Immigration in an Age of Fear that was asking a lot of these questions and trying to answer that from a Calvinist perspective. Now, for people in my audience who do not know what that means, what is a Calvinist?
So Calvinists came out of the Reformation, breaking off from the Catholic Church, led by a man.
I'm not going to hold that against you.
Yes, thank you. So led by a man named John Calvin in the 16th century. And they are famous for focusing on the sovereignty of God over all of life and particularly over one's soul, that it's God who is sovereign.
Explain really quick like how the Calvinist idea of pluralism is different from the Catholic view.
Oh, man. Well, I don't want to venture too far into Catholicism to speak for to speak for you all. But if you do a bad job, I'll cut it out. It's fine.
But
what I would say is because Abraham Kuyper, as a Calvinist, takes the sovereignty of God so seriously, what that means is that the sovereignty of all other human powers is relativized or humbled. Mm-hmm. So the king cannot claim to be God. Neither can the people or the majority, not even the church, can claim sort of this divine sovereignty that belongs only to Christ. And so throughout Calvinist history, there has been a sort of skepticism of political power and of ecclesial power, so the church, the power of the church, and the power of the state, sort of a skepticism about centralized power. And so that caused a break with the Catholic Church, but it also caused some breaks with the monarchy and sort of a desire for a humbling of political powers, a separation of powers. So there was a lot of Calvinist influence in American governance.
And I think that's what makes this book so interesting, is because those are the two forces, ecclesial power and political power, that people are running to in Europe and in America in order to save whatever, the West, or save the white race, or save whatever from this influx of Muslim immigration.
Right. So, the book is about how should the West respond to Muslim immigration? Mm-hmm. And the issue is that many Westerners think about Muslim immigration as a problem to be solved, as Muslim presence and Muslim difference as a problem that needs to be solved. And they normally look to the state to solve that problem, or they want to give extraordinary powers to the government to solve the Muslim question, to answer it, to deal with that. And so my argument is that Calvinists, and really Christians just in general, should be very wary when Westerners look to the state to solve religious difference or to obliterate it in any way. So any sort of Western desire for the assimilation of Muslims can very easily be turned back onto Christians as well, as Christians being a problem to be solved by the Western state too.
Your book is really an attempt to chart a third way between the two loudest voices in the immigration debate. On the one hand, you have right-wing nationalism. On the left hand, or on the other hand, I guess left hand, you have the left-wing multiculturalism. Let's start with the left. What do you think is wrong with how the left has approached Muslim immigration so far?
Well, I think one of the challenges with both sides is that people are talking about Muslims rather than with Muslims. Is the first problem, those on the right and the left. So they tend to frame Muslims according to what they want Muslims to be. So those on the left don't frame Muslims in sort of the dark terms that those on the right do, but they still do frame them. So those on the left, particularly in Europe, frame Muslim immigrants as people in need, particularly people in need of the West. So they frame Muslims as people in need of education and enlightenment, people in need of sexual liberation, people in need of religious liberation. So they see them as repressed and oppressed by archaic religious forces or archaic patriarchal forces, and in need of civilizing. And so they tend to frame Muslims in terms of need, and they look to the state to educate Muslim immigrants, civilize them, liberate them, enlighten them. But they're framed in terms of their need.
And I guess the awkward moment comes when a large portion of the Muslims don't care for that or don't see what they are offering as the natural progression of humankind, like the end of history.
Right. And so many Muslims in Europe have said, look, we see European civilization, we see your sexual liberation, your materialism and your hedonism, and thanks but no thanks. We don't want that. We don't think that is the good life. So, yeah. And so
then it becomes necessary a lot of times, which is sort of the paradox of liberalism. It becomes necessary to force that on people because obviously they're just in denial about what they really want.
Yeah, you need to force Muslims to be free.
Right. And you see that not just in our home countries, but also in Western imperialism, where we go into countries and we think, obviously, they will greet us as liberators.
Yeah.
And then they don't. And then what happens?
It really is a rehearsal of colonial, sort of old colonial patterns of the white man's burden to liberate Islam.
So that's the left. And you would see that as patronizing, but also naive in terms of the actual difficulty that it presents.
Absolutely. So they tend to romanticize Muslim immigrants as sort of quaint, unique, interesting cultures, and don't really wrestle with the deep difficulty of living in a pluralist society, and the deep challenges that pluralism presents, the pain, the cost, and the challenges. And so many center-left parties throughout Europe are failing right now and are falling to right-wing nationalists because common people are frustrated. They don't feel like center-left parties are aware of the difficulties of pluralism and the challenges going on in the city. So they see the center-left as out of touch with sort of the tough realities of pluralism on the ground, be it in Paris or London or Berlin. So, yeah. And
so on the right, for right-wing nationalism, what would you see as the problem with right-wing nationalism then?
Yeah, so
Because that seems like if left-wing nationalism or if left-wing multiculturalism is so naive and there are these really, big issues, then, why not just go with the right?
right. So if the left frames Muslims in terms of need, the right frames Muslims in terms of threat or danger. And so both have very simplistic framing. So yeah, the right will frame Muslims in terms of a threat to national security, a threat to national culture and cohesion, a threat to the Judeo-Christian traditions of the West, just as a problem to be neutralized. So while the left seeks sort of a soft, gentle, patronizing assimilation, the right desires a more hard assimilation. It's essentially a choice: either assimilate or leave.
In comes your book, which is arguing for a third way, using the Netherlands as a case study. Why'd you pick the Netherlands?
Well, two reasons. One, I was writing specifically for Americans, and I wanted Americans to look outside of their own experience and wrestle with a country that has been asking these questions about Muslim immigration for a long time. Muslim immigration hasn't been a massive national debate in the United States for very long. Right. Really, Donald Trump kicked it off, only in 2016. Before that, Muslims were largely, people that we would see on CNN in the Middle East, but not something we were thinking about too often in terms of our next door neighbors. So I wanted American readers to consider a Western country that's been wrestling with it for a long time. I also wanted them to learn some important lessons about the failures of both right-wing nationalists and left-wing multiculturalists. And you can see that in the Dutch experience over the last, 50 years with Muslims. And then the final reason why I selected the Netherlands was because it's home to a group of Christians, a history of Christian reflection on religious freedom and political life that tries to think deeply about how we live in a pluralistic culture. The Netherlands is just, because it's an international trading country for the past, 6 centuries, they've just dealt with difference for a long, long time, and they've had to wrestle with these questions. So
take us back in time to the scene, the history that you present in the book. What was going on back then? How did your perspective, Dutch Calvinism, respond to it?
Yeah, so there's this really fascinating political moment about 120 years ago in the Netherlands, where the country is divided into 4 ideological sections. You have 25% of the Dutch are Catholic, 25% are Protestant or Calvinist, 25% are socialist, and 25% are liberal. Sort of very briefly speaking, the country is cut into 4 pieces, and they're all living amongst each other. They all want to take the nation in a different direction, but none of them are powerful enough to do so. And so they have to figure out, how are we going to live together, and how are we not going to use the state to dominate one another? And so out of that unique situation, you have a group of Christians who argue that as Christians, we must do justice to those who are different from us. Not simply because it's a reasonable thing to do, but actually because God demands that we make generous space for those we disagree with. So I just find that historical moment really fascinating and sort of rich with Christian reflection on how we live with deep difference. So
how did they achieve that?
Yeah, so the particular political struggle was over who would control the schools in the nation, because the socialists wanted to raise a nation of little socialists, right? And the Catholics wanted to raise up little Catholics, and Calvinists the same. So they had to basically divide up and say that the state does not get to control the minds of the youth. We need to create generous space for different faiths to do so. And so they developed a whole sort of political theology, a Christian ethic of generous public space for difference. So, yeah, I just find it fascinating. Abraham Kuyper is the main theologian who sort of emerges in this moment. And what I do in the book is try to explore how Christians today might learn from that moment when it comes to Muslim immigration, and say, as Christians, we have very real reason to defend Muslim rights, dignity, and space in the West. There's a theological argument why we should defend our Muslim neighbors.
Yeah, one thing I like about the approach is that it affirms pluralism while maintaining the space for being philosophically or theologically non-pluralistic in a sense. Oftentimes I find myself at interfaith events, for example, and the interfaith events are usually Muslims who are conservative, and then a bunch of Christians who think everyone's going to heaven. But there is this question, and can you have people get along who just hypothetically believe that each other are going to hell?
Right.
And I want to say yes, obviously, because I don't think that that's a necessary barrier. But for much of our history, that's been there's been a continuity where the goal of the state is, the purpose of the state, the temporal sphere, is to train people in and basically make sure people go to heaven.
Yeah. So that's obviously a piece of what I'm trying to do and push against, is essentially this assumption that difference is a problem that needs to be solved here and now. So yes, I encounter a lot of Christians who assume that the way to get along with Muslims is to say, we all pray to the same God, we all basically believe the same thing. There's nothing terribly different between Christianity and Islam. And it's our difference that is the problem. And we need to sort of deny those deep differences, pretend they don't exist, and then everything will go well. The problem, of course, is, while I certainly applaud the desire to get along, that is not a sustainable road to peace. And you're actually, as a Christian, your chief resource for peacemaking is Jesus Christ. And
right.
if you boil Jesus down into, a sort of a cosmic universal sage that fits for all faiths, he's no longer much of a resource to you in sort of the painful, difficult, sacrificial work of hospitality and space making for others. So, and furthermore, in my experience in the Netherlands, and I'd be really curious of your experience as well, I've found that Muslims really appreciate a candid, conversation about the interesting differences between the faiths, and they don't find it threatening at all that there are differences between Christianity and Islam, and they actually find it refreshing.
Yeah, that's exactly what I found. I found people. I find a spectrum of people, but there's a lot of times I'll have people come up to me, who are Muslim, and they're, I guess, trying to make me feel welcome, and so they're like reassuring me that there's no difference between us, and that our religions are basically the same, and we all worship the same God, and et cetera. But the people that I know are very, very candid, and they they appreciate there being honesty about what we believe, as long as it's presented truthfully and not viciously. But I think that and I think, Pope Benedict said this as well, that what Muslims in Europe, that liberals in Europe think that talking about Christianity is offensive to Muslims.
Yeah.
But that what Muslims are actually offended by is the emptying of the sacred from everyday life.
Yes.
And that they experience that as much more hostile to Islam, which it is, than a robust public Christianity. Because you go to, I was in Jordan last year, and Jordan because it's not a liberal democracy, it's a monarchy, and but what underneath that you have Christians, Jews, and Muslims living on top of each other, and they're all very, very public about it. It's very public, expressive faith, and you have like neighborhoods that are, almost like a little Christendom, and then you have like you can hear the Adhan at night, and it's very what I like to call chunky pluralism, where it's very, very, very robust that way. And I think people just greatly exaggerate how much people will get offended by particularist expressions of faith. And those people will rarely, I don't, but they would rarely, I guess, correct a Muslim if the Muslim were to express something particularistic. So, like, for example, I was talking on a podcast earlier with my friend Gibran Khan, who writes for the National Review, and we're talking about Bernie Sanders grilling this guy from Wheaton for he was up for a post for the House Management and Budget Office, and he had written an essay at Wheaton where he said that he didn't believe that Muslims were saved. And Bernie Sanders was going after him, saying that was Islamophobic, and that that was necessarily hostile to Islam, and that therefore he shouldn't be able to be in office. And it was weird to me because, like, I know tons of Muslims who are involved in politics who don't believe that Christians who have heard about Islam and reject it are going to heaven. Mm-hmm. But you wouldn't necessarily see them getting grilled. Yep. Which might just be because of power dynamics in the United States. So I sort of understand that a little bit. But I wonder. I guess part of my hesitance with the experiment is that it seems like the kind of experiment that would work really well if a country was divided into fourths, where no one has enough power, so you're like, okay. And you say in the book that diversity is a positive good. Yeah, it's a good thing for resisting tyranny. And I think in a lot of people's minds, tolerance is good as a function of prudence. Mm-hmm. That it's something that you tolerate, and you have people in your country who don't like your religion, so you're like, okay, well, that's fine as long as they don't bother anybody. But you wouldn't necessarily see it as a positive good, as a thing that you would welcome as you would welcome it begrudgingly, I suppose. And I think that's more true if you're talking about things that you consider to be error than it would be if you were to consider like a different culture or a different race or something, where you obviously wouldn't say that was bad. It was just different. Yeah. But with religion, it's something that you believe to be an error. So how can error be a positive good in your culture?
Yeah. So let me give you this example. I wrote an article specifically about giving thanks for the hijab and its presence in my neighborhood as kind of a thought experiment about this. So, I go to the grocery store. I live in Houston, and we have a very large Muslim community, and I regularly pass women wearing hijabs in my grocery store. And I wrote an article specifically talking about my thanks for its presence in my life, and specifically reflecting on the controversy in France, in which France banned Muslim girls from wearing any headscarf in a French public school. And there are all of these accounts of the French finding the hijab to be repressive, to be threatening, to be aggressive towards them, all kinds of fascinating things. But what I said in that article was that the very presence of the hijab in my neighborhood, and by that we were just talking about the presence of difference, deep religious difference, it does a number of things for me, specifically as a citizen, and for my city of Houston, and I would argue for America. So her wearing that causes me as a citizen to reflect on my own assumptions about sexual liberation, my own assumptions about material goods and fashion. It causes me to reflect on my own faith for a moment. I have to pause and ask myself, would I be willing to display myself publicly and my faith publicly? She humbles me with her willingness to do so. Of course, I can't know or assume why she's wearing it. There are many different reasons why women wear the headscarf, but her presence in my city, in my neighborhood, in my country causes me to reflect on pluralism and difference, and causes my country to reflect on that. And just as her fellow citizen, I'm grateful for her questioning American assumptions about fashion, about religion in public spaces, about sexuality and gender, about piety, and all sorts of things. So I think that the presence of that religious difference is good for a democracy. That democracy depends upon citizens being willing to challenge political norms, religious norms, cultural norms. That makes for a healthy democratic culture.
I like that. I mean, one of the things that I've experienced in my own life is being drawn to a more serious, I don't want to say devout. It feels weird to it's kind of like saying you're not prideful. Where if you say you're devout, then you're just asking for like the next week to be lazy or something. It's just something that happens. But I have become more devout of a Christian and more practicing of a Christian because of being around Muslims.
Yep.
Where Jordan Denari Duffner, she talks about in her book about holy envy, this idea of seeing other people being faithful and being envious of that.
Yeah.
And it drawing you to your own traditions, which I think is an important distinction as far as types of pluralism, because I think that a lot of people, pluralism to them means that we need to learn from Muslims because Islam contains something that we don't have, for example, and that we need to sort of sample all the different religions and cobble together our own view. And so we end up with this kind of strange,
buffet.
Frankenstein, buffet, Frankenstein monster religion, which is just Freemasonry or something. I don't know. But
what it really ends up looking like is just what we want it to be, actually.
Right.
It's essentially a mirror.
Yeah, it's like the search for the historical Jesus. It's you're looking down the well and just seeing your own reflection. It's not that you're looking for something that your religion is lacking. It's that I'm
not looking for revelation from her.
Right. You're looking for, and you're reminded of, and it's from the outside comes this question, and then you are forced to ask yourself why your faith does not have that, or maybe it used to have it and you don't have that anymore. Why don't we go on pilgrimages anymore often, right? Why don't we pray 5 times a day? Is there something that we used to do that we don't do anymore? And I mean, for me, this process of asking like what in Islam, all these different things about fasting and stuff, why we didn't do that anymore. That's what actually ended up leading me to Catholicism. Not to preach to you, but like, is that Catholicism like, oh, like we did actually used to do all that stuff, and now we don't. And why have we lost that over a long period of time?
Well, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, coming from a Protestant or an evangelical tradition that is pretty thin in terms of ritual and discipline and formation, is really focused on the word. That makes a lot of sense to me, how Islam could drive you to.
Yeah, for sure. And I asked you about whether diversity was a good as such, or whether it was just a matter of prudence for people who are out of power. I was very influenced growing up, and when I was in college at Covenant College, which is which you've been to and you spoke at, a very lovely place. I was very influenced by Stanley Hauerwas and reading him, but over time I got this sense that he was writing from a place of exile, where he feels as if the church is not powerful anymore, which it isn't, and that Christians are increasingly becoming a minority, and that he turned that into a normative thing, that was good, or that was somehow the norm for Christians. And there's this romanticization, I think, of being out of power and having and so what happens when you do get power? What happens if you do the Benedict option, for example, and you end up in 100 years like outbreeding everybody, and now you're in charge of the country? What do you do? Do you still retain that commitment to pluralism, or are you like, oh man, awesome, we can do Christendom now? I think the Catholic view is, I mean, there isn't one, but like the Catholic view is that, you tolerate all these things, but like if you find yourself in control of the government, then obviously the government should favor the Catholic Church. And for you, like a country full of Dutch Calvinists would still be affirming of diversity and affirming of difference.
Yeah. And so I think you've kind of said, you've answered the earlier question of the difference between Catholics and Calvinists on this question of political culture, at least for my particular breed of Calvinists, which would say that it is wrong to give political advantage to one church or one faith over another. That is a theological error to do so. That's
right.
Unjust to advantage one church over another. So yeah, that is a push, and it's simply to say that Christ alone sort of is the one who's going to make those is the only one who can rightfully make those decisions at the end of time. So. Yeah. Right.
And you said later in the book, it's tough. And you said later in the book that you had this really nice Trinitarian formula for this, that God the Son is, I think I wrote this down. You said God the Son is both temporally and spiritually sovereign. God the Holy Spirit is at work in all faiths and cultures through common grace. And God the Father is the common creator and father of all people. And yes, that's really beautiful, and I would affirm that. But one distinction that stops me real quick is something we touched on earlier, is that none of those are explicitly mediated through human beings.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's this distance that you get in Calvinist theology between God and humanity that I think the Catholic faith feels more comfortable allowing for a human institution or a human individual to mediate God to the world, whereas Calvinists are always going to create this separation. So we're always going to doubt in our own ability to mediate God to the world, that we can never control or completely know our Creator. And so that creates this sort of critical distance that we don't want to invest, sort of divine power revelation in a human structure.
Is that what happens though, or is the mediation then just thrown to the people?
Right. So that's the issue with modernity, is what happens when sort of in French or sort of radical secular democracy, you say that the voice of the people is the voice of God. So what the majority wants is God's will. And that is sort of the deification of the people and their desires, which is sort of, I guess, a secular Calvinism, if you could imagine such a thing. So,
right, but with Calvinism, it is more democratized than Catholicism.
Yep.
And so do you actually solve the issue of sovereignty, or is it just sort of dispersed among the people?
Oh, no, I certainly don't solve the problem of pluralism. I think I'm pretty careful about that. I don't think that Calvinism solves all questions of sovereignty or all questions of pluralism or how Christians, Muslims, and Jews can get along, but it provides certain theological safeguards from these different dangers. And the dangers are sort of theocracy or Constantinianism on one side, and the other danger is a sort of secular hegemony or a secular totalitarianism. And what Calvinism provides is, or this particular form of, Calvinist pluralism provides, is a sort of theological buffering or safety net from theocracy on one side or secularocracy on the other side, which is to.
And so, what actually happened in the Netherlands? And like, did this experiment succeed?
Oh no, because the church lost. So modernity and secularism grew in the Netherlands really quickly in the 1950s and 60s. And the church got much, much smaller. And as secular liberalism grew in power, it started to dismantle this pluralistic structure and started to sort of dominate once again. And so the power balance that existed has been weakened in many ways. But, you can still see there's in Dutch constitutional law, there's still a lot of pluralistic sort of legal structures that still defend Muslim rights and Jewish rights and Christian rights. But the secular majority of the Netherlands is less and less interested in defending those constitutional traditions.
And so what do you think the future looks like with the Netherlands?
Well, I think what I talk about in the Netherlands and really throughout Europe is as Europe becomes more and more secular, it needs to find new reasons for tolerance. So historically, European arguments for tolerance and religious freedom have been theological arguments. God demands that we be peaceful. Right. And as Europe moves away from Christianity, it can't really use those theological arguments anymore. And as it grows in its fear of Islam, and it needs to find new coherent reasons to tolerate people who are different. And I think it's an open question what's going to happen to Europe. I mean, you have right-wing nationalist parties growing throughout the continent. And I think a lot of people are alarmed, with Brexit and many other things happening, is how is Europe going to hold itself together in terms of its sort of moral, cultural, political fabric. I just think that's an open question. That was a little grim.
No, it's my views are somewhat grim because I think that I can think of a case for pluralism but I don't know if it would be very convincing to people once they get in charge. I think that it's convincing to people who are not in power on why they need to welcome people into their neighborhoods, for example, and why they need to approach people and work together and et cetera. But it's hard to explain that to people who think they are about to get the ring of Sauron, right? Who well, all that's very good, but that's an argument from prudence. And I need to, we don't actually need these people. So, and I like the idea, and I think this is possible, is that the Muslim immigration into Europe may lead to a renewed spirituality in Europe that has been lost, and that won't just be Muslim, right? That it'll be a re-spiritualization, and Europe may once again find a spiritual center that would obviously be different than before, because it would be through this interaction.
Philip Jenkins' new book, well, it's not new anymore, but it's called God's Continent, specifically looking at the revival of faith throughout Europe through Islam, but also through African immigration and the immigration of Christians from Africa. I think there is a lot of emerging evidence to say that if the church in Europe is going to be saved, it is actually going to be through immigration. And
right, because his previous book was on, or he may have written one in between, was on how the locus of Christendom had shifted from the first world to the third world.
Yep. Yeah, and
so Christianity
I
itself
myself
is very...
Yeah, and even in the Netherlands, I saw this on the ground. Old, dying white churches receiving new life as they opened themselves up to immigrants and started to have meals with them and engage with them. It actually reminded them of what the Christian faith is all about, which is, as I argue, hospitality. And so it's that while this challenge can be difficult and painful and fear-inducing for some Europeans, it can also be revival-inducing. So,
yeah, a few episodes ago, I was talking with this guy, Murtaza Hussein, about the Great Replacement, this conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
Which is, it's a conspiracy theory to think of it as a conspiracy, but it is a process that's happening, where the Muslim population in Europe is going up and the Christian population is going down, and people who are thought of as white aren't having lots of babies. And now the speed at which this is happening is debatable, and of course who's behind it is what makes it a conspiracy theory that ultimately led to the New Zealand shooting. That was the guy's main thing. But there is this fear of demographic change that I think has taken precedent over our view of the faith. And so our Christianity becomes a parody of what it once was, because now it's just being defined against the foreigner.
Yeah. So a couple things, like I get this question often when I speak at Christian colleges and things like that. Are they going to sort of take over questions about Sharia or questions about, birthing rates and things like that? Mm-hmm. And like two main things. One is, first of all, you are assuming that Muslims have Muslim babies. And that's not always the case. Of course, many Muslims in Europe and the United States convert to other faiths or to no faith. So it's not necessarily the case that that happens. But the bigger thing is really for these Christian college students that I'm speaking to is, tell me about this fear and anxiety in your voice. And if you are a person of the resurrection, if you are a person who believes in the power of the gospel and the Holy Spirit, we just sang that 5 minutes ago in your chapel service, tell me about this anxiety and fear in your voice. Are you not confident in the church? And, are you not confident in this gospel you sing of? Does Jesus really need the government to protect his church? So that's normally where I go with my, with these students is, let's investigate this anxiety that you have. And is that something a person who believes in resurrection should be carrying?
I think that's a good point, and it reminds me of, this is literally the only piece of information I remember from reading anyone who's a postmodernist, but it was Jacques Derrida's book on hospitality, where he talks about this paradox of you can't be hospitable towards people unless you own it, unless you own what you're being hospitable with.
Yep.
So I can invite you to my house and be hospitable, and being hospitable means that what's mine is yours, but it's not actually yours. It's mine.
Yep.
And if I really did give it to you, then it wouldn't be hospitality anymore. It would just be yours. Mm-hmm. And so is it that we are welcoming Muslims into our country and being hospitable to Muslims, or is it that Muslims are just as part of our country as we are?
Well, this is the danger with hospitality language, and why I try to be careful with using it, and I was a little anxious about it being in the title of my book, is the danger of hospitality language in these kinds of discussions is I set myself up as always being the host as the Christian, mm-hmm. and Muslims will always be the guest, sort of in an inferior mm-hmm. position. But my argument is that with a good and healthy understanding of hospitality, the guest is not perpetually in that position, but you get to a point where Muslims can play the host and I can play the guest, and there's this mutuality that is engaged. So that's sort of the danger of political hospitality language, is you can sometimes not recognize sort of the power dynamics at play when some people use that word.
Yeah, and it's even weird for me to talk about because I have these biases. So when I think about Muslim immigration, I think about Muslims coming into my country, right? And even though I'm very Muslim friendly, I still think of it in terms of that. And it's probably just media stuff and the way that it's structured, and but in my experience, it's always been Muslims welcoming me into their homes and feeding me dinner and into their communities. And their hospitality is legendary. And especially in Pakistan, right? Where like when I go to Pakistan, everyone is incredibly hospitable, and it's like the key feature of that country is just everyone is like, please come in, have whatever you want. And then we're debating. It's ironic. There's just a paradox here that we're debating how to welcome Muslims, when they're the ones who are welcoming us the most.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was in Edinburgh this past year at the University of Edinburgh. They have this great emerging sort of network that they've started with Christian and Muslim scholars, and
it's great.
And a scholar by the name of Mona Siddiqui. I believe she's from Pakistan originally, but grew up in the UK.
Yeah.
And she wrote this great little book on Islam and hospitality. And it really does outline that. It's a great pairing with my book on Christian hospitality, on these questions of, rich Muslim arguments for space making, coming out of Middle Eastern cultures in which hospitality was, critical to survival. And anyways, I commend her book to you as well. That's a great little piece.
You state in your book that religious communities will never receive justice from liberals for the simple reason that liberals do not understand religion. Why do you say that? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, that's a little grim. I hope I say it a little softer than that, but I think
I'm drawn to grim stuff.
So I think the main challenge for liberals who find themselves in a position of power over religious communities is that they misunderstand how faith works in three fundamental ways. The first misunderstanding, and this comes from Abraham Kuyper's work, is the plurality of faiths. So liberals often assume that The difference between faiths is a temporary state, and they can be united or joined through some form of education or political machinery, that we can get these faiths together, that they're not really fundamentally all that different. The second misunderstanding is the private nature of faith. So liberals assume that faith can be privatized, that you can ask a person of faith to keep their faith to themselves, to keep it in their homes, to keep it in their own religious buildings. And it's perfectly acceptable to ask them not to, allow their faith to influence their politics or their economics or the way they engage with the larger culture. So those are the first two misunderstandings. And the final misunderstanding for liberals is that they don't recognize that every person has a faith. So they believe that it's possible to escape faith, or better yet, they believe it's possible to transcend faith and just be neutral, or just be rational, or just be scientific. They believe faith is something that you can escape. And so that puts them in a really dangerous position, because if you believe that you can sort of transcend the religions of the world, then you start to make the political assumption that you are qualified to rule the religions of the world. Mm-hmm. And that is really what has happened in Europe. And I think that's increasingly the danger for the Democratic Party in America, is this belief that we have sort of outgrown religion or transcended religion in such a way that these people are somewhat backwards, and we need to enlighten them and rule them. So it's proper that we rule them. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm reminded of William Cavanaugh's book, The Myth of Religious Violence, where he goes through and deconstructs this, even just the idea of religion, where the idea of religion as this separate sphere of life.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great book. It's essentially, his argument is that religion the concept of religion is a modern invention, and it is essentially designed to control people. So we can define certain people or certain ideas as religious, and therefore, superstitious, irrational, backwards, conservative. And we can define other ideas and people as secular, and therefore public and rational and sort of useful in political life. So it is he uncovers the power dynamics that are going on when things are defined as religious in modern societies.
And that's one thing that I've noticed whenever there's like an Islamic terrorist attack, and people will then compare that to Christians, and they'll use that to compare Islam and Christianity, and they'll say that Islam is violent and Christianity is not. But what they mean by Islam is the entire civilizational aspect of Islam. It's the institutions and the people acting on behalf of the state or on behalf of people trying to create a state, really anything. And then when they compare that to Christianity, what they mean by Christianity is this private set of beliefs. And so a Christian who controls a drone and kills people in Pakistan, well, they didn't do that because of Christianity, though. Mm-hmm. And then you're like, well, but like the difference, and this is like something that I really, really have held on to and really like about Calvinism, is that no, it's all theological. Like once you get down to it, it's all religion, and you can't just separate it out, because that's the trick they do.
Absolutely. So, I mean, we could make a similar argument about capitalism and communism being very violent religious forces in the world that have very specific visions of the common good and systems of value, and they're willing to kill for it. Capitalism and communism can both be read as, if honestly, more deadly in the 20th century than Islam or Christianity combined. Mm-hmm. The wars of the 20th century are really, to be understood through the lens of, a religious conflict between capitalism and communism. And so the division between so-called religious violence and secular violence is not terribly helpful.
It's really not.
Capitalism, they all have visions of the common good that they're trying to defend, and they're willing to, sacrifice their sons for it. So,
I really appreciate you coming on. I wanted to end by, number one, talking about Notre Dame. You've been there?
yes.
I saw the picture of you and your kids at there, and that you posted. And what was your first impression when you heard that it was burning down?
Oh, I just felt sick. I felt sick. I haven't. Yeah, I can't remember feeling that sick about a building. I have to say that I've been to Paris a number of times, and I had this ritual of I would get up early in the morning, normally because my clock was all messed up from traveling across the Atlantic, and I'd go to the Notre Dame at about 6 a.m, and I would just sit outside and wait for it to open, and I would be the first person in there, and I just remember the darkness of it and the sunrise breaking through the rose windows, and I can remember, just the smell of it, and I think I went in there in a particularly intense moment of incense in there, and so I remember the smell, and I have very fond memories of that place. I think that, and I think I said this on Twitter, that my sense of many of the greatest arguments for Catholicism are not written with words, but with glass and stone. And I think, I
definitely think that's just true.
So I think of the Notre Dame as one of the Catholic Church's greatest arguments for its faith, and something I think all Christians and really all people in the world, I think it's just an important treasure. It's been interesting to watch the reactions. Yeah,
it really has. I was thinking just of the reactions where I'm a cynical person, and so when I look at the reaction to it, I mean my reaction to it being burning was just horror and sadness. But looking at everyone else's reaction to it, particularly in France, it reminded me of when a restaurant closes in your town that was an institution.
Yeah.
And you're just devastated that it closed, but you also haven't been to it in 10 years. And you know what I mean? Like, and of course I'm cynical. So I'm like, well, then you should have gone. And like, you can't complain about it closing unless you're going to be gone. But at the same time, I also tweeted that this materiality of our faith, which I think is something, I mean, all faiths have, a material expression, but I mean, particularly Catholicism, where that's what holds you over when you have periods of faithlessness. Yeah. Where you have stuff in your, you have a neighborhood, you have a church in your neighborhood, and you stop going for a year, but then you come back, and your faith gets renewed, and you come back, and it's still there, but if everyone stops going at the same time, then it goes away, and then maybe your faith never gets renewed because you never see it again, and it's been interesting seeing France mourn this, but not really know why.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a couple things. Let me try something out on you, and you just tell me what you think about this.
Yeah, please.
I think one of the things I want to say is I think there's a sense in which, I mean, Churchill was right? We build our buildings, and then our buildings build us. And so when an important building that's been formative for a country burns, it's like losing their mother in a sort of important sense. And so that France, is as much as it might want to be secular, it's very Christ haunted. It's very sort of haunted by.
Yes, that's how Flannery O'Connor described the South.
Yes,
was Christ haunted.
Yeah. So I see that. I think. Yeah, so I mean that's my sense of what's going on is,
and there's a kind of you bring up the idea of losing your mother, and there's a special pain of losing your mother when you've been estranged from her for so long.
Yeah,
where you haven't talked to your mother in 10 years, and you've been angry, and you meant to reconcile, but you haven't reconciled yet, and then you find out she died, and she died before you can even reconcile. And I think that might be part of the very confusing grief going on among people in France who hate religion. That this was something that used to be very important to them, and that maybe at times they think should be important to them again. And then now it's not completely gone. They can rebuild it. There's it's not like it got blown up with a nuclear bomb or anything. It's they can still redo the insides, and so I wouldn't give it that long. It certainly won't take 150 years to rebuild it like it took to build it in the first place.
Okay, so
but yeah, go ahead.
You said one other thing that jumped out, and this is what I actually wanted to try out on you is let me dabble in Catholicism for a moment.
Please, yeah.
My sense from my readings of Catholic history and my just sort of knowledge of Catholics is there's this comfort with momentary lapses in faith, where the church will essentially say, it's okay if you don't believe today, we will believe for you. And the church there, Notre Dame, stands, I think, particularly in the French imagination, as it's standing there believing for us, even if we can't believe it. And so it's dear to us. I think of the poet, I forget who it was, who said, I don't believe in God, but I miss him. And so I'm just thinking to myself that the Notre Dame represents, and just Catholic buildings in general, in their materiality, hold some kind of faith for the believer, even if they can't hold it for that moment. Whereas in the Protestant imagination, it is very much more on the individual's responsibility to maintain faith. And the individualistic, I think, lonely nature of American evangelicalism in general is you're sort of responsible for your faith and the maintenance of it. Whereas in the Catholic churches, no, the church carries your faith like with you in some kind of.
It does. And there's a part in every mass when they say, look not on our faith, or look not on our sins, but on the faith of your church.
Yeah.
And that always, as a Protestant, jarred me, because I'm like, shouldn't you say, look not on our sins, but on faith of Christ? But there is that sense that it's carrying your faith. But I mean, which isn't to say that you can then commit a mortal sin and it's okay because the church believes for you and you can apostatize and that's fine. Which could be the danger that you see, that it's such a corporate thing that you think that it will survive without you. Like, oh, well, I'm sure lots of people go to that restaurant. And even though when everyone does that, it turns out no one goes to the restaurant. Well, I don't want to go there because it's always so busy. And then turns out nobody goes.
Yeah. And
so it's not busy at all. Yeah, I think that's definitely, and I think you saw that there were two people who, Brandon McGinty and Michael Brennan Doherty, who were arguing on Twitter because Brennan had this reaction of that they shouldn't rebuild it, that the faith of the French people had gone away, and so they need to just leave it this empty husk, because that it would be the perfect example of the French faith. And then, which I think is an understandable response, but not a good one, because our faith is bound up with what's around us, and especially the kinds of faith that the common person has. There's a kind of elitism in thinking that your faith will survive the collapse of institutions. And I'm a pretty stubborn person, so I think that if everybody around me stopped being Catholic, I would still be Catholic. I'd still believe it. But I think that there's a kind of pull yourself up by your spiritual bootstraps idea, where you don't need the laws to say you don't have to work on Sunday. And there's I do see a lot of Christians being supposedly okay with the collapse of Christianity as a public good or a public faith because, well, they'll still be Christian. And I'm like, well, okay, but the percentage will go down because there are lots and lots of Christians who can't continue and won't continue to be faithful unless there's a critical mass, unless there's a certain percentage of people who are like that. Which is one thing that has always worried me about forms of Christian ethics like Hauerwas that seem okay with being in exile and that seem okay with the sort of Benedict option type of thing, because there's a certain privilege there where, well, I can drive 4 hours to go to church. I'm a comedian, so I travel, and so I can go to Mass whenever I want to. I can order an Uber to take me to Mass, whereas some people work every day and need to be able to take Sundays off. And so I think that one frustration I have with sort of non-political Christianity is the assumption that we can maintain our own faith just through sheer force of will.
I think that's right. I have no quibble with you, brother.
Yeah.
Go for it.
I wanted to end with how you ended, which I think is appropriate because we are doing this on. I don't know if you. I never heard this when I was a Calvinist, but today is Spy Wednesday, because it's the day that Judas agreed to betray Jesus. So this is Holy Week.
Yeah.
And we just finished with Palm Sunday, and then we had Holy Monday and Holy Tuesday, Jesus at Bethany, and Jesus predicting his own death. And then today is Spy Wednesday when Judas betrayed Jesus. And then we get to tomorrow is the upper room, and you end your book talking about Holy Week. And so I was wondering if you could just take us through it, starting with Palm Sunday, the streets of Jerusalem, and how that relates to hospitality.
Yeah. Well, I think what I do in the book and what I'd like to share today is really just that Holy Week, seen through the lens of hospitality. It's really tremendous to see the role of meals, both before, during, and after Holy Week, of really what Christ is, really what the work of Christ is that a space making towards friend and foe alike that is willing to pay a tremendous cost for relationship to be reconciled to friend and foe alike. And we see that at the Lord's Supper. We see that on the cross of arms outstretched for a world that rejected him. And we see that after the resurrection, the road to Emmaus, the meal at Emmaus, sitting down and breaking bread. It's only when the bread is broken and the table is shared that they recognize that is Christ. And he makes himself known to his disciples on the beach by making them breakfast. And so the cross needs to be understood as an act of divine hospitality, of God making space for humanity when they were far off. A willingness, not of sort of cheap or romantic hospitality, but a vulnerable hospitality to a world that is sometimes dangerous and difficult. And I think that in a globalizing world in which difference is coming at us in deep, difficult, and quick ways, citizens of the world need to become good at hospitality and good at extending a vulnerable hand that is not armed with a sword, and say, sit down with me, not as I want you to sit down with me, but as yourself, and let's have a conversation.
It's beautiful. Thank you so much for joining us, Matthew, and thank you, and hope to have you on again soon.
Oh, I hope so. Thanks a lot. This is great, and best of luck with the podcast, brother. This is a good conversation. I'm grateful for you and your work on this.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, that's it for this episode of Holy Wars. I'd like to thank everyone who donated on Patreon to support this project, and I would ask everyone who is listening to do the same. We'll see you next time. Thank you.